I knew something was wrong before I even got out of my truck. You spend enough years on the same piece of land, you learn it sounds the way you learn a family member's voice, and as I rolled down the dirt road toward my ranch that afternoon, one sound was missing. The creek. That little stretch of water had been running through the backside of my property longer than I'd been alive, and even when you couldn't see it, you could hear it. It was always there, soft and steady, like background music. Except that day, nothing. Just silence. I killed the engine and sat there for a second, listening. Still nothing. Now, I'd only been gone for 8 days. I wasn't on vacation or anything glamorous. I was helping my cousin Ethan with a cattle auction about 2 counties over. We do that sometimes, helping each other out when livestock prices start shifting. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Leave for a week, come home, check fences, feed schedules, and get back to normal life. Instead, I stepped out of my truck and walked straight into one of the biggest fights of my life. My name is Wade Mercer, and at the time I owned just under 100 acres outside a little town called Red Hollow. Nothing fancy. Scrub grass, open pasture, a few old oak trees that somehow survived every drought, and enough cattle to keep me busy. Most people would probably drive past my place and never think twice about it. That was exactly how I liked it. Quiet, predictable, honest. The creek was a big reason for that. It cut through the back half of the ranch before winding north toward a larger watershed. My cattle drank from it. The soil depended on it. Hell, some years that creek probably saved me from bankruptcy. So when I followed the familiar trail toward the water and saw a chain-link fence standing where no fence had ever been before, I honestly thought I was looking at the wrong property. The thing stretched across the creek itself. Steel posts buried deep into fresh concrete. Bright warning signs bolted across the center. Private development property. No trespassing. I just stood there staring at it. Then I walked closer. The water wasn't flowing through anymore. It had been redirected. On the other side of the fence, beyond my property line, I could see bulldozers moving across freshly cleared dirt. Huge sections of land had been stripped bare. Orange survey stakes covered the landscape. Someone was building something big, really big. For a minute, I couldn't even process what I was seeing. My first thought was that there had to be some mistake. Maybe the construction crew got confused about property boundaries. Maybe a subcontractor screwed up. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The creek hadn't accidentally been blocked. It had been engineered. Pipes, trenches, grading work. Somebody spent serious money rerouting that water. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. I remember laughing, not because it was funny. Sometimes when you're angry enough, your brain just does strange things. I stood there looking at the empty creek bed on my side and the new retention pond forming on theirs and actually laughed. Then I went home. Most people expected me to storm over there and start screaming. Truth is, I almost did. But age teaches you things. One lesson I've learned is that the first person who loses their temper usually loses the fight. So instead, I made coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, opened an old filing cabinet, and started reading. About an hour later, I found what I was looking for. The original water rights documentation attached to the property transfer from nearly 40 years earlier. I'd seen it before when I bought the ranch, but never paid much attention because nobody had ever challenged it. This time I read every page. Twice. Then a third time. And the more I read, the calmer I became. Because what those developers had taken wasn't just access to water. Legally speaking, the water flowing through that section of creek belonged to my property rights. They hadn't simply inconvenienced me. They had created a very expensive problem for themselves. The next morning, I started making calls. Quiet calls. The kind where you ask more questions than you answer. By lunchtime, I had a name. Silver Ridge Communities, a regional development company that had been buying land all across the county. Fast growth, aggressive expansion, the sort of company that showed up promising jobs and new housing while leaving locals wondering what happened to the landscape afterward. I called an old friend named Greg who worked in commercial surveying. He sighed before I even finished explaining. "Let me guess," he said. "Silver Ridge." I told him he was right. He laughed. "Those guys think every piece of land comes with a price tag and no owner." That stuck with me, because it was exactly what this felt like. They hadn't asked permission because they assumed permission wasn't necessary. Somewhere in a boardroom, somebody looked at my ranch and saw an obstacle instead of a person. What they didn't realize was that obstacles don't usually hire lawyers. People do. 3 days later, I was sitting across from a property attorney named Linda Brooks. She spent about 20 minutes reviewing maps before leaning back in her chair and saying the words that changed everything. "Wade, if your documents are accurate, they just handed you leverage." I remember smiling at that word. Leverage. Because suddenly this wasn't about a creek anymore. It wasn't even about water. It was about respect. Somebody decided my rights were less important than their schedule. Somebody decided my land existed for their convenience. And I was starting to think they were about to regret that decision more than they could possibly imagine. The following week turned into one of the strangest periods of my life, because on the surface, it looked like nothing was happening. I still fed cattle every morning. I still repaired fences. I still stopped by Miller's feed store every Thursday for supplies and bad coffee. But underneath that routine, gears were turning. Linda moved fast, faster than I expected. She assembled survey records, satellite imagery, environmental reports, water flow documentation, and enough paperwork to fill a pickup bed. Meanwhile, I started digging into Silver Ridge communities. At first, it was simple curiosity. I want to know who thought they could walk onto someone else's land and reroute a creek without so much as a phone call. What I found was a company that looked impressive from a distance, but shaky up close. Their advertisements were everywhere. New neighborhoods, luxury living, modern communities, smiling families standing in front of houses that probably cost twice what most locals could afford. But when I started reading financial filings and public records, a different picture emerged. They had projects scattered across 3 counties, several behind schedule, some facing permitting issues, and a few carrying loans large enough to make my eyes widen. One evening, my cousin Ethan came by and found me surrounded by papers. He looked around the kitchen and said, "You planning to sue them or run for governor?" I laughed and handed him a folder. 20 minutes later, he whistled. "These boys are carrying a lot of debt." "That's what I'm seeing," I said. Ethan shook his head. "Then why in the world would they pick a fight over a creek?" I leaned back in my chair. Because people get careless when nobody's stopped them before. 2 days later, Linda filed the injunction. The response was immediate. Construction crews vanished. Equipment stopped moving. The site went quiet. Word spread fast around Red Hollow. Folks started stopping me in town, asking what happened. I usually just smiled and said, "Water dispute." That answer never seemed to satisfy anybody. Small towns run on curiosity the same way trucks run on gasoline. A week after construction halted, I finally received a call from Silver Ridge. The man introduced himself as Carson Vale, one of their senior project directors. His voice had that polished corporate confidence that sounds friendly until you actually listen to the words. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding." Misunderstanding. That word almost made me laugh. I looked out the kitchen window toward my pasture. A misunderstanding is when somebody borrows the wrong truck. You diverted a creek. There was a pause. Then he shifted into legal language. Infrastructure needs, community benefit, temporary modifications, regional development priorities. The more he talked, the more obvious it became that nobody at Silver Ridge thought they had done anything wrong. They viewed my property rights as an inconvenience standing in the way of a profitable schedule. When he finally stopped talking, I asked a simple question. "Who gave you permission?" Silence. 3 seconds. For seconds. Then he changed the subject. That told me everything I needed to know. The lawsuit kept moving, but something else had started happening in the background. Every report I reviewed seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Silver Ridge wasn't healthy. They were overextended. Aggressively overextended. Their growth depended on constant expansion, constant investor confidence, and constant construction progress. The moment any one of those slowed down, the entire machine became vulnerable. One evening, Linda called me. "I've got good news." "Let's hear it." "Their lenders are nervous." I sat up straighter. "How nervous?" "Nervous enough to start asking questions." Now, most people would probably assume that was the moment I felt victorious. It wasn't. If anything, That was the moment my perspective shifted, because I realized something. Winning the lawsuit would stop the project. It would restore my water. It would punish them, but it wouldn't change the people making the decisions. Somewhere down the road, another landowner would probably end up dealing with the same nonsense. That's when an idea started forming. At first, it felt ridiculous, completely unrealistic, the kind of thought you dismiss before saying it out loud. But the more I examined the numbers, the less ridiculous it became. A few days later, I met with an old acquaintance named Marcus Delaney. Marcus spent most of his career in private investment and had a talent for spotting opportunities nobody else noticed. We met for lunch at a diner 40 miles away because neither of us wanted local gossip spreading too quickly. I laid everything out: the creek, the lawsuit, the debt, the stalled development. Marcus listened without interrupting. Then he folded his hands and looked at me. "You're thinking about buying them." It wasn't a question. I stared at him for a second. "That obvious?" He laughed. "Wade, you've got the same look cattle buyers get right before an auction." We spent 3 hours reviewing possibilities. Not buying the entire company outright. That would have been impossible. But acquiring a controlling interest through a combination of investors, holding entities, and distressed assets? That was different. Difficult, but possible. Especially if lenders started losing confidence. Over the next month, conversations happened that I never imagined having. Investment groups, financial advisors, attorneys, bank representatives. While Silver Ridge focused on defending itself in court, pieces of its ownership structure quietly began shifting. One lender sold exposure. Another wanted out. Minority shareholders started looking for exits. Every delay made them more nervous. Every environmental concern created additional pressure. Every week construction remained frozen, increased costs. Then came the moment everything changed. Marcus called me late one Friday evening. "It's happening." "What's happening?" "The board approved restructuring discussions." I felt my pulse quicken. "You're serious?" "Dead serious." "Wait, they're desperate." I barely slept that night. Not because I was worried, because I couldn't stop thinking about how absurd the situation had become. 30 days earlier, I was arguing over a stolen creek. Now I was discussing corporate acquisition strategies. Life can take strange turns when people underestimate you. 6 weeks later, I walked into Silver Ridge headquarters for the first time. Glass building, expensive furniture, reception area designed to impress investors. The kind of place where nobody expected a rancher wearing work boots to become one of the most influential people in the room. The board meeting itself felt almost surreal. Several executives looked confused. Others looked irritated. A few seemed genuinely alarmed. Carson Vale was there, the same man who called my property dispute a misunderstanding. When our eyes met, recognition flashed across his face. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then one board member cleared his throat and began discussing restructuring plans. I listened quietly. Numbers, liabilities, risk exposure, debt obligations, future projections. Eventually, the conversation turned toward ownership changes. That's when Carson finally spoke. "You're involved in this?" I looked at him. "Looks that way." His jaw tightened. "This is because of the creek." I leaned back in my chair. "No, this is because your company believed it could take something that didn't belong to it." Nobody said a word after that. The room went completely silent. And sitting there, looking around that polished conference table, I realized something that surprised even me. I wasn't angry anymore. The anger had burned off weeks earlier. What remained was clarity. They built their entire strategy around the assumption that ordinary people wouldn't push back. That assumption was about to become the most expensive mistake Silver Ridge had ever made. By the end of the meeting, the framework was in place. The control structure had shifted. New leadership authority was being established. And for the first time since this whole mess started, the people who fenced off my water were no longer making the decisions. They were waiting to hear mine. The next morning, I walked into headquarters before most employees arrived. The building was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles over a place when people know change is coming, but nobody knows exactly what it will look like. I stood by the conference room window for a minute watching the sunrise hit the hills beyond town, and I remember thinking how strange life can be. A couple months earlier, I had been standing beside an empty creek bed, wondering who stole my water. Now, I was the one reviewing company reports and signing executive directives. The first order I approved was the easiest decision of my entire life. Restore the creek immediately. No studies. No committees. No dilas. Just fix it. By noon, contractors were already removing sections of the fence. Excavators reshaped the diversion channels. Crews worked through the afternoon, reconnecting the original flow path. I drove out to the ranch before sunset and stood near the creek bank. For a while, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a faint trickle. A few seconds later, water appeared around the bend, moving slowly at first, then gathering strength as it followed the course it had carved through that land for generations. I won't pretend it was some dramatic movie moment where angels started singing. Mostly I just stood there with my hands in my pockets and smiled. It felt right, like something that had been out of place was finally back where it belonged. My neighbor Hank pulled up in his truck about 10 minutes later. He climbed out, looked at the water, and shook his head. "You actually did it. Looks like it." He laughed. "You know, everybody in town thinks you're crazy now. Only now." He laughed harder at that. But restoring the creek was only the beginning. Once I gained access to the internal reports, engineering assessments, environmental reviews, and planning documents, I started seeing things nobody had bothered to mention publicly. The development next to my property wasn't just risky. It was dangerously optimistic. The entire project depended on drainage assumptions that looked great on paper and terrible in reality. The retention pond they diverted my creek into wasn't large enough for major seasonal flooding. Several consultants had raised concerns. Some reports recommended redesigns. Others suggested delaying construction until additional environmental studies were completed. Those warnings had been buried beneath deadlines and budget pressure. In other words, exactly the kind of corner cutting I suspected from the beginning. A week later, I sat across from Carson Vale again. This time, he wasn't calling the shots. He looked exhausted. "You're shutting down the project." It wasn't a question. "I'm reviewing it." He gave me a look that said he wasn't interested in technical wording. "You know, investors are going to walk away." I folded my hands. Then maybe the project wasn't as strong as everybody claimed. He stared at me for several seconds. Hundreds of homes in a flood-prone area, that could be managed. Maybe, maybe not. But we're not gambling with people's lives because somebody wanted quarterly numbers to look better. For the first time since we'd met, Carson didn't have a comeback. Maybe because deep down he knew I was right. Maybe because he'd spent months defending decisions he never fully believed in. Either way, the conversation ended there. Over the next several weeks, independent environmental reviews were ordered. Additional inspections followed. Permit questions emerged. Financial stress increased. Investors who had been nervous became terrified. One by one, they backed away. Funding commitments disappeared. Expansion plans collapsed. The development slowed, then stalled, then effectively died. The irony wasn't lost on anybody. The same water they tried to steal ended up exposing the weakness that destroyed the project. By the end of the quarter, the land next to my ranch sat empty. Survey stakes disappeared. Equipment was hauled away. Sales offices closed. What remained was a large stretch of untouched ground and a very expensive lesson. Meanwhile, the company itself survived. That part surprised some people. They expected revenge. They expected me to burn everything down. But revenge is expensive, and honestly, it gets boring after a while. What interested me more was fixing what had been broken. New management policies were implemented. Property rights reviews became mandatory. Environmental compliance standards tightened. Community consultation became part of every major project discussion. The company stopped behaving like it could simply bulldoze its way through problems. Funny enough, once that happened, business actually improved. Turns out treating people with respect is usually a better long-term strategy than fighting them. Every now and then somebody asks if I regret not pushing harder. If I regret not trying to destroy every executive involved. The truth is no, because destruction wasn't the victory. Accountability was. Years have passed since all this happened. The creek still runs through the back of my ranch. My cattle still drink from it. The oak trees are still standing. Most mornings look exactly the way they did before Silver Ridge ever showed up. And honestly, that's probably my favorite part of the story. After all the lawyers, meetings, lawsuits, negotiations, and corporate drama, the reward wasn't wealth or power. It was peace. Real peace. The kind you only appreciate after somebody tries to take it away. Sometimes I'll walk down to the creek just before sunset and listen to the water moving through the grass. And every once in a while, I'll think about that fence, about how confident those developers were when they installed it, about how certain they were that nobody would challenge them. They thought they were taking control of a resource. What they actually did was start a chain reaction that cost them the very company they were trying to expand. Maybe there's a lesson in that. Maybe there isn't. That's for other people to decide. What I do know is this. When people stop seeing land, homes, and communities as places that belong to real human beings, bad decisions usually follow. Eventually somebody pushes back. Eventually somebody says enough. In my case, that somebody happened to be a rancher with a filing cabinet full of old documents and enough patience to play the long game. But here's the question I still think about, and I'd genuinely like to hear your opinion. If you were in my position, would you have stopped after winning the lawsuit and getting your water back? Or would you have done exactly what I did and taken control of the company itself? Was it justice? Was it revenge? Or was it something in between? Let me know down in the comments, because I've heard arguments from both sides for years, and honestly, I still find the debate fascinating. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves real-world conflicts, property disputes, and stories where ordinary people refuse to be pushed around. And remember, sometimes the biggest mistake a powerful person can make is assuming the quiet guy won't fight back.